This panel on CBRS, it was highly anticipated because there were a lot of questions about CBRS after yesterday's discussion. So I'm very interested to hear what we have to say. I want to thank Tim for moderating this, first of all, to give me a little bit of a break. I've got panels this afternoon to do. So I hope you all enjoy the day. This is a great panel, so I'm glad we got to kick off with this. And thank you all for being here with us. And Tim, it's your show.
Thanks so much, Rich. Again, I'm Tim Moynihan. I'm delighted to be honored to be hosting this panel. You can see our panelists there. We're running a couple minutes behind, so we're just going to get right into it. But I wanted to start off the panel today by just referencing a comment John made yesterday, that CBRS can solve a lot of problems for commercial real estate folks. So we're going to explore that a little bit more and see if it really can, and what some of the implications are, some of the challenges might be, and how it really can today and tomorrow as you look forward. So I wanted to level set immediately. I'm going to ask Kevin to talk a little bit about CBRS and just kind of what it is, just at its very basics, and some of the things that you should need to know, that we're all on the same page as we're discussing it over the next 45 minutes or so.
Hey everyone, my name is Kevin Hansen. I work at Google in our wireless services business, and so we're pushing strategic initiatives around delivering more bandwidth to American consumers, and so CBRS is our main focus right now. And at an ultra high level, for those of you who aren't aware, what is CBRS? Up until recently, if you wanted to deploy any sort of wireless technology, you'd either have to go and license spectrum from the FCC and spend billions of dollars, or use an unlicensed technology like Wi-Fi. And CBRS is a first step in what we call shared spectrum. And so what that means is that there are incumbents who currently use pieces of that spectrum, whether it's the Navy or whether it's satellite operators. And this is the first time where we're sharing that with the incumbents. And so there's a thing called a spectrum access system that your radio will talk to and find out what channels are available and then transmit on that. And we call it three-tiered spectrum access, because the first tier is that we protect the incumbents, so the Navy, satellite operators, etc. And then the second tier being, in June, CBRS is 150 megahertz of spectrum, and 80 megahertz of that is going to be auctioned off for what's called priority access at a county-by-county level in the United States. And then 70 megahertz left will be open access or general access to the public. And so the spectrum access systems will first protect the incumbents, then make sure that the priority access is respected, but then there's still 70 megahertz of open spectrum. And I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for connected real estate, because as you deploy indoor, I think a lot of that generally available spectrum is going to be super useful. And it's going to give you, if you want to think at a high level of the benefits, I like to think of it as economics of deployment that are similar to Wi-Fi, meaning that you can buy your own base station, you can deploy your own hardware, but it gives you the benefits of cellular.
Okay, thanks so much. Many of us have been around technology. We were discussing it this morning over coffee about our careers and things and how much change we've seen. And one thing that we've all experienced is hype. We've all experienced technology as it exists on the hype cycle. So I wanted to begin there. I want to ask each of the panelists, where are we on the CBRS hype cycle? And I'd also like to ask them a little bit, how real is it? And if it's real, give us a concrete example and talk a little bit about that. So, let's talk about the hype and maybe an example around that and kind of where we are on things. So why don't I start at the end with Paul, and we'll come down this way.
Okay, can you hear me okay? So it's interesting because the hype comes in a couple different flavors. Us in the industry, I think we're all very geeked up about what's going on with CBRS. We can see how many problems it actually can solve for the industry and for consumers. But on the flip side, if you look at the general population out there, they really have no clue what it is. So I think a good chunk of our responsibility is to actually create even more hype around this technology and get more people engaged so that they can see this as a platform to actually solve a lot of their problems. And right here today we're talking about the use cases associated with this technology for the real estate industry, but there are many other use cases associated within the industrial environment, logistics, for example. It's a good platform to actually bring a lot of different technologies onto one platform to service many needs, and real estate being a prime one that we've been involved with one of the first offerings in the United States in New Jersey at the American Dream facility, which is right next to the Giants Stadium or MetLife Stadium, where we're actually deploying this technology to solve a lot of their needs.
Yeah, and I'll follow on. I do think the technology is real. I'm very excited about the shared spectrum aspect. I think it has the potential to be transformational in our industry. I think the hype really starts to come in as you start to peel the onion back on some of the use cases. I think purpose-driven, CBRS kind of data-driven or purpose-built networks we'll see first, but you start moving into voice or RAN sharing and some of these other more elaborate use cases, the complexities just are hard to get your head around sometimes. So I think looking at the use cases and the technology and trying to get those aligned, I think is real, but I get a little nervous when you start looking at voice and 911 services and things like that. It can get pretty complicated pretty quick.
Hey, Todd Christner. I'm the guy that grew the beard, just so you know. But anyway, no, the hype is real. The technology's solid. One of the things that I've been experiencing over the last year is where people have existing agreements on venues to broadcast wireless signal inside those venues. So, like a 3PO, right? And they're wondering if they have that agreement and somebody buys a PAL in that area, a priority access license in that area. Does that allow them to come in and broadcast in that venue where they have the rights to that venue? How does that affect the venue owner? So I'd agree with what fellow panelists were saying, that there's some complexities that still need to be worked out, right? So as you start looking at how that starts to happen, and where I think people like us in this room are going to be valuable in that is sorting through that kind of the legal, the contracts, existing stuff, when a PAL is there, when the general access, when the incumbents, how all that stuff comes together. Because there's a lot of questions that are starting to come up and how it affects people that have existing rights to certain venues or certain places, right, what that looks like. So.
Yeah, I just echo what they're saying, that there's still some questions that need to be answered around how things are going to work when the rubber meets the road. But I think the one thing to underscore is how real the technology is. So if you've purchased an iPhone 11 or Pixel 4, your phone has CBRS. So I think in order for this to work, we need device support, and then we need support from major operators. So most phones that are going to be sold in the next year have CBRS. So that's great from a handset penetration perspective. And then from a deployment perspective, we're really seeing three different sets of use cases that are taking off. So one, the traditional network operators, the big four. Many of them are out there deploying CBRS today, and even though their use case is different than the one in this room, as they go and deploy network, it's only increasing the need for handsets to support the network. Then we're seeing fixed wireless fixed wireless companies all around the United States that are delivering point-to-point access from building to building using CBRS technology. And then I think people in this room represent what we consider the third use case, which is private LTE, and that is nascent and really we're starting to see it take off, but it's early days. But I think we can be confident that the technology is real from a technology perspective, or from a radio perspective, as well as from a handset perspective. So the foundation is there, and it just needs people to build the use cases on top of it.
Hi, I'm Jim Jacobellis with Geoverse, and I don't think there's a ton of hype per se around CBRS. I think there is generally a little bit of a misunderstanding more than anything, and I think that misunderstanding originated from a kind of somewhat misinformation about just putting up a small cell and you're going to be able to get a Verizon, an AT&T, a T-Mobile signal, and that sort of thing. So I think the private LTE applications are what's emerging, and what we're seeing as real at Geoverse, and we do have dozens of deployments with partners like A&S and directly with enterprises, is where you have a situation where Wi-Fi is not good enough, the cost of wiring is prohibitive, and there's use cases like electronic signage. There's use cases like cameras from across a parking lot. But one of the things that we do is we also enable one of the really kind of pain points with Wi-Fi, and that's Wi-Fi calling. We enable VoLTE as a replacement for Wi-Fi calling. So that's kind of how I view the landscape right now.
Excellent, excellent. I want to pick up on a couple of the comments, and maybe we can delve into a couple real-life examples that each of you have had. And Jim, I'll pick on you. We'll go down back this way. Maybe you can talk about an example that you guys have learned a lot from and really wanted to share with the group. Maybe an implementation. You talked a little bit about some of the use cases, which are super important. But what's some of the other lessons you've learned in some of these implementations?
Yeah, I'd say every time you do a new implementation, you'll learn a lesson. But I will say that some of the things brought up about PSAP and E911, those really need to be thought out when you get into the voice services and using a smartphone for that. And we just happen to be lucky enough to be owned by a parent company who owns a half a dozen or so cellular carriers, so we can do that with our network. But learning how to do that and learning that you have to work with phones that are unlocked, so you just can't buy a phone from Verizon and expect it to be, CBRS ready. I'd say those are, some of the things we've learned along the way. And each phone, whether it be a Google Pixel or an iPhone or a Sony or Samsung, they're all different.
Right.
So.
Sure, I'll talk about one use case that's a little bit different. I think sometimes when we think about CBRS, we focus on handsets and phones. But there's all sorts of other interesting use cases. So, for example, we were working with a couple stadium venues, and I'm sure you've probably all experienced this when you go to a stadium where maybe you want to buy something and someone's coming down the stands, and they're typically going to be cash-only transactions, and if they're using a credit card, maybe it's going to work, maybe it's not. It's a big pain point for stadiums. And so what we found is that a couple of them are deploying CBRS so that they can still provide Wi-Fi to their guests, but their point-of-sale systems now communicate over CBRS. You've got these old buildings, these big concrete facilities. Some of them are wired up, some of them aren't. But with CBRS, then they don't need to worry about everybody, trying to refresh their fantasy sports, clogging down the system so that they can't sell goods to people at the stadiums.
One that I found interesting last year was we were working with the university and working with another OEM that had a low voltage sensors, and they were using CBRS, private LTE. So they were putting these sensors out in remote areas, and they were able to transmit that information sporadically, so they had security for on the campus around areas where you'd have to cable a lot of stuff to get to those things. They were able to come up with a solution where using that private LTE, these low sensors with low usage of power out in those areas, they were able to deploy at a very reasonable cost and get the security on the campus that they wanted. So.
Specific to commercial real estate, we've kind of grouped three high-level use cases, if you will. We're trying to spend some time right now to what we just call slicing the network and looking at these use cases and using CBRS, and we have some other spectrum that we're trying right now as well. But really building multiple use cases on the same platform gets to be a little bit of a challenge. We're spending a lot of time looking at kind of the core and the provisioning of devices out to the end. I just, recently, it's been a little while since I've been into the SIM and the eSIM world, and how cumbersome that can be to, really start to provision devices. As you're looking at thousands of devices or tens of thousands of devices, it can get to be a little bit of a challenge. So we're looking real hard at what we call the BSS or the OSS, the operational systems, and how we can push self-provisioning to a commercial real estate asset owner so they can deploy IoT devices being one of the use cases. As we move into some of the other use cases, we just call it data services or Wi-Fi replacement type service, and then ultimately working with the carriers to do some RAN sharing or using these same platforms for the carriers' traffic to work on these networks as well. So trying to look at all three of those use cases on a same platform can get overwhelming.
Yeah, first of all, I Guess I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Paul Fatucci from A&S, Advanced Network Services, so get that out of the way. But to kind of dovetail on what Kevin was talking about with the stadium use cases, at American Dream, that's a lot of the initial deployment that they're doing with that facility. For example, just to give you some background, they're expected to have 40 million visitors annually, over 500 events in that location. It covers 600 acres of land. They have about 450 tenants that are expected to be there. They're bringing them on board every day. There's over 33,000 parking spaces in there. There's mass transit, there's Uber, there's Lyft, there's all this traffic control. So the initial deployment of the CBRS network was really to allow for signage and kiosks to control the flow of people initially. And then in the consequent phases, they were actually looking for point of sales systems where, for example, when people go into the venue and they're going to do one of the rides, and I don't know how familiar you are of that, it's really an indoor amusement park and retail space. So what they're looking to do is when the people buy their tickets potentially in the parking lot, they're on the CBRS network to buy those tickets. And then when they walk into the facility, they're actually getting their tickets scanned by a handheld device, which is CBR enabled. And so they have a seamless flow of information that that the IT department can actually look at the analytics around, the demographics of the people coming, the time, and things of that nature. The other component that's getting done now as well is backhaul for Wi-Fi. So they're giving Wi-Fi to their security guard shacks where they're controlling the traffic, but the backbone of that is actually the CBRS network. So those are just some of the use cases that they're starting to utilize in that. Down the road, the handheld phones, security cameras are another big component of the use case associated with that. So as we move and go down the path of CBRS, it's an evolving technology. Manufacturers are really starting to jump on the bandwagon and bring a lot more devices, either IoT devices, to the table so that can foster seamless integration into the network.
Paul, I want to follow up, and I'll ask each of the panelists too, where technologies like Wi-Fi coexisting with LTE and things like that, there's been some thinking that Wi-Fi is more of a visitor connectivity experience where you might be walking into a building and have Wi-Fi in the lobby but not LTE and things like that. But in your example, you talked about CBRS using for visitors. So how do you see that playing out, particularly in the commercial real estate, as a big building, and how does CBRS affect visitors as opposed to the tenants and things like that?
So that's a little bit of a complex question. So I'll see if I can answer it. But so first of all, as the handheld devices come into play, you will have if you have a CBRS network in your facility, you'll have seamless transition from the CBRS private LTE network to the carrier's macro site. And so unlike Wi-Fi today, some cases there are seamless handoffs, but in most cases you're on a Wi-Fi network using your phone, you walk outside, the phone drops. You won't have that experience on the CBRS network. And that's really due to there's a couple different pieces that are tied that we really haven't talked about, the EPC and the SAS. And the SAS really is a dynamic control mechanism for bandwidth allocation that's really going to control the private LTE piece versus what the carriers are using in the macro network versus what the Navy and some of the satellite providers use it. That's also a gateway it's a gateway for example, if we have an emergency, a national emergency, and the Navy needs to grab that spectrum back, that SAS will allow within 24 hours to take that spectrum back so the Navy can use it, and that'll kind of throttle back the uses for both the PALs and the GAA. So you have to kind of consider that when you're doing it. But the other piece really is the phone piece is really the key part in that allocation from the private network out to the public network. Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess right now the only way to really move between public networks and private networks is a dual SIM kind of arrangement. But even in the private network, in the voice side, you still need phone numbers or some sort of authentication mechanism within the phone to talk back to the core and to move back and forth. But I think the nirvana really is being able to move from private networks to public networks frictionlessly. That you don't necessarily, you've got one number that you can maintain and move around from network to network. I think that's when we'd hit the tipping point and really see critical mass in private LTE, private networks.
I'll touch on the SaaS and the mobile phones. So I went down to Apple and just bought an Apple phone, not assigned to a carrier, right? And that made it unlocked. And then I took it to AT&T, my carrier, and said I want to have signal on this phone. So my phone will support CBRS, and it is a CBSD, a device, right? So the thing that you're bringing up the SaaS, so every device that's going to operate on the CBRS network has to register with the SaaS. It has to know that you're there, it has to know you're present, it has to know what spectrum you're operating in and what you're doing. So every one of those have to come onto there. Right? So that's the complication that we're saying is starting to happen. That SaaS is critical for that stuff to happen. And that PAL, they're auctioning those off in, 10 megahertz blocks is how they're going to auction those off. Each 10 megahertz are going to come across those, so you have PAL. So that top, 70 is for the incumbents. And they've got another section that's going to go for the PALs, and that bottom section is going to be in there, right? So it isn't like somebody's going to come in and get a PAL and own all of the private spectrum within one zip code, right? They're going to own a 10 megahertz block that's within there. So hope that kind of clears some of that stuff up. That even you can go out and get a phone today from Apple, take it to your carrier. You're not going to get the carrier buyback, but that thing can have your CBRS enabled on it today.
Yeah, I think maybe you've heard some people up here talk about how some things are super figured out with CBRS and some are less figured out. And I would say right now in the less figured out, people have talked a little bit about bringing, if you have a phone, how is it going to connect to this neutral CBRS network that's in a building? And admittedly, that's one of the things that's not quite figured out yet. So if you go talk to one of the big carriers, you'll likely find two different opinions within that big company. Not half, but some amount of the people within the company will say, there's no way we'll ever roam on a neutral network. We provide this network, it's super high quality, our users expect this quality, this is what we sell.
I also think that in most locations, if you have the ability to take advantage of all 150 megahertz, you can, because the PAL, if you're not interfering with the PAL, you're able to use more than just the 80 megahertz that's available to you. And when you think about CBRS and you think about 150 megahertz, I like to look at it like this. Before the millimeter wave auction, so go 600 megahertz and below, 150 megahertz is more spectrum than Verizon or T-Mobile had. And they both spent billions of dollars, and now the enterprise has this spectrum available for their use for free. So
I wanted to. Can I just jump in there
absolutely.
real quick? I think one of the, in scaring people about the SaaS, right? So, there's a couple things. It is low powered. Just the dynamics associated with the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum is that it's very easily contained at that low power within a facility. So you don't have to worry a lot about the bleed out into the macro world. And there are some other key differences as well associated with that spectrum in comparison to Wi-Fi. So there's a lot of quality of service built into that technology. It's very secure. I mean, I can get a couple kids up here that can hack into any Wi-Fi network in about 2 minutes. And this is really, you have to get authenticated onto the network. So that creates a whole dynamic associated with security. So those are just a couple pieces that really differentiate the the 3.5 gigahertz CBRS and private LTE and eventually 5G, because there is a roadmap from this technology to 5G.
Thanks, Paul. I wanted to, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Todd. Sure.
That was the point I think we're all making, is that the SAS plays a critical part of that every device registers with the SAS, which enables that security, which enables stuff to happen, right? And so that's the key part of this whole thing that happens. So when you deploy a CBRS network, every device, some people were saying, do they have to register with the SAS or do they not? Every device has to register with the SAS, just so that it knows it's there, what spectrum it's operating in. And that's how you get that quality of service. That's how you get that security. So
Great. I wanted to shift a little bit from a technology discussion to a financial discussion. So can you guys give us perspective on how commercial real estate people are looking at this from a cost point of view? Are they looking to monetize CBRS? And what might some of the financial implications be about bringing CBRS into a existing facility? So, Paul?
So I'm not really 100% clear on what that monetization for real estate owners is at this point, and I think that's evolving in some cases, but I can talk about the use case that we've done where we've implemented our network. So when they built this facility, they actually had already paved the parking lot, and they had put power to a lot of locations where they knew they were going to put various devices. But when they did that, they never put a separate conduit in there for signaling cabling. So, you know, in the metro New York and northern New Jersey area, we know that union dictates labor prices and how things get done in a timely fashion. So they were going to have to carve up the newly paved parking lot to put conduits into all these locations to the tune of about $4 million. Okay, with developing this CBRS platform and implementing it, we were actually able to build that network for about $500,000 on the first phase. So we were able to save the client $3.5 million just from a labor and deployment standpoint. So, you know, there may not be a way for the venue owner at that facility to recoup money from deploying the network, but there is definitely a cost savings associated with that use case. And I think every one is going to be a little bit different. So it's really important that when you're talking to the end client, that you really evaluate what their needs are before you move forward with whatever technology you're using to get them the best ROI.
Yeah, Airwavz, I guess, kind of legacy or history comes from DAS type services where we put DAS equipment in high-rise buildings. We have worked with the FCC and some of the SAS operators to get higher power radios. I think there's limitations on how much power can be put inside a building. I think it's typically 1 watt for in-building, 5 watt for outdoors. But we're pretty close with the FCC to getting that buttoned up. And what that's going to enable us to do is basically put CBRS on legacy DAS or DRAN type deployments that are out there today. And again, just to help lower the costs for everybody. I know in real estate it's really about net operating income at the end of the day, and that's either by increasing the value of rents. Or the property, or reducing operating expenses through potentially IoT or building management systems. So just trying to get the cost of these systems down from the DAS world, at $1 plus a square, down below, the cost of Wi-Fi sub 50 cents is a challenge. And that's where we spent a lot of time. And I think that putting a single platform in a commercial building and then being able to use multiple use cases, whether it be IoT services or, basically data service, wireless data services for enterprise or tenants in there, or, as I said earlier, helping the carriers get more coverage and provide, RAN sharing or roaming type services in the building. So, looking at a single platform in a building that can support multiple use cases, I think is really the opportunity. I believe, and I don't have the answer yet, but being able to
provide the real estate community a revenue opportunity through this infrastructure, through wireless services, I think is really what's needed to get this to scale in the industry and get more networks as you know, Google and the others are looking to do through some of these initiatives.
I'll just dovetail on that. I think if you're listening to what we're all saying, there's multiple use applications for CBRS. And the advice that I would give is if you're looking at wanting to deploy it, I wouldn't look at CBRS as just what is. I'd look from the end user. What are you trying to solve? What problem are you trying to solve? And then where does that come from? Are your tenants requesting a specific service? Is it security? All these different technologies that we're talking about up here. You know, which one do you guys want to look at, and how do you solve it? And can CBRS fit that, right? And then once you have CBRS in the building, it's just like you're saying, how many different things can you layer on top of that with the spectrums that you have? So I think starting at that, what problem you're trying to solve first, what's important to your guys' business, each one is going to be different. What the tenants are, what the use space, if it's mixed use, retail and residential, you know, there's a lot of different things that you could deploy in that, from IoT to voice services, everything that we're talking about. So it's finding out what those things are and then building on top of that to get there. So.
Yeah, I would say when it comes to some of the financial components of CBRS deployments, I know DAS systems were mentioned, and so we talk a lot with our customers about their distributed antenna systems, and we kind of segmented buildings into 3 categories. So if you're building a new stadium or a new arena, I am sure that all 4 of the carriers would love to put antennas in there and charge you nothing for it, because they want to make sure that all of their customers can be covered. If you're building something like a hotel, okay, like maybe you can get 1 or 2 of them to come. Who's going to end up paying who is going to be interesting. But if you're building a building like a normal commercial real estate building and you want them to come in, it could be a multi-year wait. You might only get 1 of the carriers. You might get 2 of the carriers. You might get 0 of the carriers. CBRS gives you that control, and it's going to bring the cost down. So when we talk about Wi-Fi economics, what we've seen is that to cover an indoor facility, you're all probably very aware of how many Wi-Fi access points you need. We're generally seeing about for every 3 Wi-Fi access points, you'd have about 1 CBRS access point. And so each one of those has a fixed cost to deploy. You're not on the hook to pay some other carrier to bring that into your building. And in terms of monetizing it, I think that's a little bit still to be seen, but we think that if you have a piece of real estate that you have fully covered, then why wouldn't someone pay to roam on your network? Someone like, for example, we think that the virtual network operators are going to be the first to do this. Take, for example, at Google, we have Google Fi, which roams on other neutral networks. If you had an indoor building covered and you came to us and said, hey, we'd like people to roam on the building, roam on this network, we'd be open to that discussion. And there's other virtual network operators that would also be open to that. And then we think it's only a matter of time before all the carriers say, oh, yeah, well, we want our consumers to have good service in your building as well.
So the question was around monetization, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think the important thing to consider is, I think a lot of people refer to DAS as how you generally create cellular signals in commercial real estate. CBRS is kind of changing that model to be more small cell or vRAN orientated. And when you look at the fact that the CBRS spectrum is not owned by the operators and that it has each small cell, each vRAN head end has the ability to load sometimes 6 identities of operators, sometimes 24. You have the ability to put an extension of an AT&T, a Verizon, a Google, a cable company who are more than likely to bid on these PAL auctions and want to extend their footprint. So I believe that's where the most monetization is going to come from. Now, in talking with the big carriers, they make it very clear that they do not want to cut deals with individual enterprises. So one of the reasons Geoverse was to set up was to be that kind of frictionless carrier in the middle, that we already have interconnect agreements and roaming agreements with all those carriers to facilitate this. But the big kind of there's a gotcha there, and the gotcha is these band 48 phones are just now coming out. So it will be 2 years or more before you get critical mass where, the majority of the U.S. population and the majority of international roamers are actually carrying a phone capable of transmitting a band 48 signal. So you kind of got to look at this from a 2024 perspective, from a monetization, in my opinion.
Great. I think we're going to go to audience questions now. So we've got Rich, roaming Rich with the microphone.
Real quick before we take audience questions, I've got a question. Kevin, can you, because we have people that are from commercial real estate, from AHJs, from municipal governments and folks like that, can you give us what does SAS stand for? What is it? What's the definition and how does that work, please?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. The term SaaS has been tossed around here, and I don't even like the term SaaS because everyone then thinks software as a service, right? Where it's actually just SAS. It's a spectrum access system. And so, to be clear, Google's not the only provider of this. There are other providers of spectrum access systems out there for CBRS. And basically, what it is a system that your radio is going to check and heartbeat every so often and say, "Hey, am I still okay to transmit on this band? Am I still okay to transmit on this band?" Take, for example, a place like San Diego. Maybe you have a new hotel that you've built there on the coast. Well, the incumbents, as we've talked about, do have priority over the spectrum. So we have sensors on the coast that are going to detect when a naval ship comes in. It's one of those things where they don't use the spectrum that often, but when they use it, they want to make sure that they can actually use it. So if a naval ship comes in, we're going to check and say, hey, oh, by the way, you need to stop using this specific channel of CBRS for some amount of time. Keep heartbeating back to us to make sure to find out when you can use it again. And then once the ship has left or once they stop transmitting, that piece of spectrum will be released again. So you hear this talk of 150 megahertz of spectrum. So that's quite a bit of spectrum. And it's sort of all subdivided. So the lower 100 is a part that we call dynamic protection, and that's where we have these sensors up to protect the Navy. The top 50 is reserved for fixed satellite services that are incumbents, and they're not all around the United States. They're in certain cities and things like that. And what we've generally found is, in general, you're likely to be able to get some spectrum, especially if you are doing indoor deployments, right, where the power level is lower. But anyhow, so that's the point of a spectrum access system, is to check in and find out, based on people who have priority access, based on the Navy, based on fixed satellite service, what spectrum is available for me to use, and that's where you're going to get assigned dynamically.
Gotcha. Good.
I think it's not. I just wanted to make one thing clear. It's not just the Navy. It's like 17 naval radar ships that. So it's not every Navy ship that comes by is going to, create disturbance. It's only a certain type of Navy ship.
So in essence, if you think about it, it's like a PBX system of old, that it would give you a channel to use and make sure that channel was clear.
Yeah.
Good. Questions?
Hi. So it feels like the private case is pretty straightforward, and there was a lot of talk around monetization and how you work with carriers. I'm just curious, does anyone have a view from direct discussions with carriers on, their willingness to roam? It makes a ton of sense, but where are their heads at on this? Even if they're not going to pay, when are they going to enter into roaming agreements where they'll actually, if you have an iPhone, you'll be able to roam onto, that building's network?
Yeah, so this is, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, this is where it's still split within those organizations. So some people within the organization think that that's the only way that their users are going to get great coverage indoor, and some people think there's no way, because what if we let them roam on a neutral network, and then that neutral network offers a lower quality of network than we offer, there's no way we're going to do that. But then you have companies like Geoverse that are solving that from a different angle. So that is it's still to be determined.
Yeah, I think the important thing to understand if you're contemplating deploying a CBRS network, the one thing that's very different from Wi-Fi is you need a SIM card, and you need a SIM card that gets an identity. So if you're going about this on your own and you're not partnering with an operator, your choice is to go to the CBRS Alliance and get an IMSI block from them to put in these SIM cards, and you then have the ability to have your own little island CBRS network. If you partner with a company like us, who is a mobile network operator, we enable our SIM card or our IMSI blocks on your SIM cards, and that gives you the ability to roam with the major mobile network operators and that sort of thing. So we're able to do that right now.
It seems if you want a CBRS network, someone like commercial real estate person who's sitting here in the audience, you need a stack of vendors in order to make that happen. You need an OEM for the radios. You need a connection to the SAS to make sure you're pulling a channel. You need somebody to complete the call. So
I'm going to disagree with that, Rich,
Okay.
because I think you only need one or two partners, and the partner can be an ANS who's able to coordinate the install, do the physical configurations, maybe manage some of it, and then an operator who can work through ANS to enable all this. So they could be your single point of contact. We can be working in the background, or we can be the single point of contact, and they could be working in the background.
Yeah. Good. No, that's a good answer, Jim.
So
Thank you.
I just wanted to touch on the question there. So I think if you're in commercial real estate, what you've heard recently is the carrier saying, bring your own DAS. We'll provide signal, but bring your own DAS. So they're not going to pay to put a system in anymore. So CBRS is one of those avenues, to your point, where they are looking at it for the enterprise customers to start to put these systems in that they then can provide signal. The thing that I think is important that is that as a tenant owner or a real estate owner and the carrier, you both have the same problem you're trying to solve. You want the end user to have service. The carriers want the same thing, right? So this helps mitigate that risk or the tension that's in there in what it costs them to deploy or expand their network to make it go out. So I think this is a great opportunity for real estate to start to deploy their DAS. So to that point, if you deploy a CBR system in your building, right, then people can come in and you then have control. I like the point. It puts the control back in your hands of what's happening in your venue as to what those fees are, and you have more control over that revenue component that's in there and to provide the service. So,
but if a carrier, say Verizon, they serve the building from the outside in, and there's a CBRS system in that building, who's in control of when that network decides to switch over?
So I think in this
when
case,
that end user device.
This is why it's important to go with a partner that has these agreements set up. So there are CBRS, there are DAS companies out there that are specifically doing CBRS deployments. I think the tension is going to be if you just go and you buy your own hardware off the shelf and you set it up in the building, you're going to have a tough time getting calls from the major network operators. So I think that's where it is important to go with a partner that already has those relationships in place. So as a commercial real estate provider, you're not thinking about that. That's already taken care of for you.
Yep. We've had a number of conversations with all of the carriers, and each carrier has very unique views of this particular application. The way we're looking at it is just really, again, slicing the network and looking at the RAN, but being able to connect that RAN directly to one of the major cellular carriers' network. So the RAN really looks like the carrier's network, not a standalone CBRS. It's actually integrated into the core of the carrier's network. So that's the approach we're taking. So the carrier still controls the authentication, the features, the quality, but we just operate the RAN on their behalf. So,
Okay. Other questions from the audience?
John Edwin down here, front, Rich.
Okay.
Rich is there.
Thanks, Rich. I probably got 3 or 4, but I'll try to. First, to me, the location-based services use case is, to me, the most important piece here, because you're going to have amazing throughput. You're going to have, just terrific bandwidth in areas where you currently don't. So I'd like all of you to comment on that. Specifically to Google, we were out visiting you all, and we got a presentation on Buttonwood, and I was hoping you could drill down on that a little bit. And then finally, just in terms of, I think, this concept of an owner doing it themselves versus having someone who's actually going to manage these services for the owner, if you could drill down on that. So sorry for the 3 questions, but
Yeah, I think I'll hopefully address all 3 pretty quickly. So the first one is, you mentioned the connectivity and the throughput, right? So I actually have a really good example of this. One of the major network operator providers that we work with recently deployed CBRS in a stadium in the Midwest. And as you know, like pretty much the worst place to go for cell phone signal is when you're at a sports game. And that's when you want it the most, right? Because you want to check on the scores and things like that. So what they found was actually 10% of all the devices were CBRS enabled. And this was actually about 6 weeks ago. So considering the dates of a lot of these phones being released, we were pretty excited to see that 10% of the stadiums in the phone already had CBRS. And those phones were accounting for 40% of the bandwidth used in the stadium. And we're getting 400 megabits down in the stadium, which is like really cool. That was using aggregation, so they were aggregating a couple of their other bands, but those other bands were pretty saturated. So that was almost all CBRS doing the work. Okay, so that was point 1. Question was about a project we have at Google called Buttonwood. So Buttonwood is a group within Google that is focusing very much on a system for aggregating neutral networks. And those networks could be Wi-Fi, or they could be CBRS, or they could be something else. So we work closely with that team. I'm not directly on that team, but the idea there is that if you create a network, it's trying to solve the problem that we all talk about, which is if you create a network and you create a network and you create a network, how is that phone going to connect? Who's going to pay for it? What's the rate? Is it free? Is it not? It's a group that's trying to solve that connectivity problem. And I apologize, I forget your third question.
location was just managed services versus owner doing it themselves.
Oh, okay. Owner doing it themselves. Yeah. So at Google, from a spectrum access perspective, we're working with a variety of different companies, and some of them are managed service providers. So a company like, for example, Geoverse that delivers its own mobile network, or there's companies that are building out CBRS-based DAS systems, et cetera. And so I think that if you go with, if you are a commercial real estate provider, you can set it up yourself, or you can work with a provider that has things like roaming agreements already built in, so that you're sort of protected.
Okay, question.
Ask about location-based.
It was around location as it related to the throughput. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think did he answer the question, John?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments?
Question. So for the stadium application, to allow the roaming on the CBRS network, were you guys broadcasting the PLM ID for all the carriers?
Oh, so for that stadium, that was deployed by the carrier. So that was not a neutral network. That's just an example of CBRS throughput in a crowded space.
Okay. And one more comment on the panel. I think we're done. We need to move on to the next panel. But somebody else? No, I think it's been really helpful. Anybody else? One last comment?
To your point of whether whether the venue owner owns it or it's managed, I think what's important about that is to pick a partner who can help you make that decision. And look at it from the perspective of what are the technologies you're looking to deploy within your venue, whether it's a real estate, what it is, and look at it holistically, and then have a partner that understands all those pieces, because you heard all the different use cases and the different things that can happen in there. So to have somebody that can look at it holistically with you, help you make the decision on what pieces you own, what pieces need to be managed, what pieces and where that turns into revenue for you, either from your tenants or from the carriers or from people wanting to have access to it. Yeah. But it's looking at it holistically.
It appears that commercial real estate owner would have trouble going to a carrier negotiating interconnect agreements as a non-telecom provider.
Yeah. Hey, Rich, I was just wondering why there were no 5G questions. That's that's a first.
One of the things we're seeing right now, there's some OEMs out there that have what they're calling CBRS in a box. Use cases are going to be very, very limited. We're spending a lot of time in the back office and the operational support systems trying to look at this with multiple use cases in mind. And what we're seeing is a lot of the big manufacturers are having a very difficult time scaling down. They can scale to millions and millions of subscribers, but getting down to thousands or tens of thousands of devices is becoming a real challenge for them. And just the cost of entry to get in it's very expensive very quick. So.
This has been great fun, but I'm sorry we have to move on to our next panel, which is...
I want to thank you panelists. Thanks for the preparation. Thanks for being here, and thanks for everything. Great.
And thank you, Tim, for moderating.